All right, now everybody be careful. You're officially being recorded.
Okay. I say we hop to it then. Got the backup plan here in case folks join late or aren't able to join, and we're a couple minutes in anyway. So thanks, Ryan, for taking the time to do this for us, and I'll leave it to you guys.
Perfect. So maybe just so for those of you that haven't met myself or Rick, we'll do a quick introduction on our end, and then we'll kind of jump into it. So my name is Ryan Meester, for those of you that I haven't met yet. I'm a director with Alithya now. I apologize, I haven't updated our slide deck. It's relatively new. We were acquired by Alithya officially on November 1st, so I just haven't gotten around to updating the slide deck here yet. But it's business as usual. We're an Oracle shop that focuses on the Hyperion tool set, as well as BI and a number of other things now. And our skill set actually has been expanded quite a bit since joining with Alithya, and I'll let Rick maybe talk a little bit to that when he does his intro. But my role here at Alithya, I'm a director in the central region. I manage a group of about 20 people in the central region across all the different product sets with Hyperion. But my background really came from the strategic planning space with Hyperion Strategic Finance, which is the on-premise version of the tool that I'm going to be showing you guys today. I started at Hyperion itself, working on that team, and then broke off and started my own consulting firm focused on implementing Hyperion Strategic Finance. And then we were acquired by Ranzel back in May of 2010. So I've been working with this group here now for a little over 8 years. So I'm going to be focusing most of the time today on the demonstration of the tool we now call strategic modeling, which is the business process within EPBCS that really caters to the needs of the full financial balance sheet, cash flow modeling, scenario analysis, and those type of things. So that's going to be my role on the call today. So Rick, maybe let you do a quick intro of yourself, and then we'll jump into it.
Great, thanks, Ryan. So hi, everyone. This is Rick Torres, and I'm based out of Boston, and my role is I'm on the account management side, so I cover all of GE. And so as Ryan was mentioning, Ranzel, we're officially now Alithya, but Ranzel, we've been an Oracle Platinum partner for the last 20 years, doing primarily Hyperion, so it's the EPM stack, which is Hyperion, BI, and big data. And on the Hyperion side, we're one of the leading providers now moving to the cloud, whether it's new cloud or ground to cloud. We're big proponents of the Oracle Cloud offering. And so today we're going to be showing you the strategic modeling capability, which came from the on-premise strategic finance that Ryan is an expert in that's now moved to the cloud. But basically anything in the cloud is really our focus moving forward. And looking forward to showing you this. And if you have any questions or follow-up, I would be your key contact along with Ryan. So without any further ado, let me turn it back to Ryan, and you can take us through it.
All right, perfect. So I just have a couple of quick slides that I'm going to do as a bit of an intro, and then I'm going to focus the majority of the time on here in the demo. I know I think I blocked off an hour and a half. I should be able to get through the majority of this within the hour. But then I wanted to make sure we had time for questions and follow-up if you guys had anything else as well. If you have anything or any questions as I'm going through this, feel free to just stop me, interrupt me at the time. I find that answering the questions as they come up is a little bit easier to do. So just interrupt me, and sometimes if I'm in the flow of the demo, I might not hear you, so don't hesitate to jump in and make sure you stop if you have a question and I can clarify something for you. So Ryan, what I want to start off. Sure, go ahead.
Ryan, one thing right off the bat, the top left bullet on working capital balance sheet forecasting, is it just highlighting working capital because that's a universally important segment of the balance sheet, and you can actually do the driver-based or other kind of scenario things on other accounts, or are there only, so for example, is it just set up to do like, plug to a turns number and then I'll back in a flow? Or if I have a sundry loss account that has some particular KPI thing that I want to link, can it be for other operating accounts, or is it just built around working capital scenario planning?
Oh, it's a good question. Actually, it's the first thing I'm going to kind of point out here. And so to kind of get to that, let me first do a little bit of a framework in terms of what the full suite of EPBCS has to offer, and then where strategic modeling fits in and how that compares to the other business processes like the financials module, which is where I highlighted that working capital balance sheet forecasting component. So within EPBCS, we have all these different business processes. And the strategic modeling component is relatively new. It came out about a year ago. So before that came out, we had the financials process, workforce, capital planning, and project financial planning as the core pieces of what they had as EPBCS. The financials module was the place in which you could actually generate financial statements. And you do have placeholders or the ability to actually put in a full income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow. The problem, though, is from a modeling perspective within the core financials module, there is not a lot of pre-built content to do the full balance sheet, especially from a treasury perspective. So the debt modeling, the funding routine, as well as the complexity of generating a cash flow in terms of understanding, was the change in this balance sheet really an operating change, or was it a change due to acquisition or a non-cash change that should be a write-off on the cash flow statement? So the intricacies of the cash flow statement are not really captured within the financials. So the purpose of that financials business process was really meant to basically just be a shell that could host the set of financial statements with some very limited logic to actually drive the financial statements themselves. So it had a focus to be able to build, let's say if you had a detailed need to do accounts receivable by customer, as an example, and you had hundreds of customers that you needed to track. The financials module would be great at that because you have a dimension for customer. You can build that detail in and really drive that AR balance out for you going forward. But it doesn't have the capability to do an automatic funding routine where you can decide how you want to allocate surpluses and deficits. It doesn't have a debt scheduler that allows you to model out term debt instruments and see how they flow over the course of the next 3 to 5 to 10 years. And that's really where strategic modeling picks up the gap. And when that came into place, it rounded out the rest of the capabilities from a balance sheet perspective. So to your question there, if you have more driver-based detail in other accounts outside of working capital on the balance sheet, that is certainly something that strategic modeling fits the bill for. And that's really what we see, is that we're using these other business processes within EPBCS to really focus mostly on operating profit level of activity on the income statement and working capital and fixed capital investment components on the balance sheet. And then we feed that into the strategic modeling business process that would really round out the full set of financial statements, as well as give you a platform to model out the financials at a little bit higher level of detail, and then be able to use them for things like scenario analysis and that sort of thing. So does that kind of answer the question there in terms of kind of what the fit is and what the capabilities are there?
Yeah, that's a good start. Thanks, Ryan.
Okay, perfect. So the strategic modeling component really did fill this gap. We had a gap in the process, and more often than not, what was happening with this type of modeling that we do in strategic modeling is it was being offloaded into Excel spreadsheets. Again, not to say that certain components of it couldn't be done in on-premise planning or within the financials business process, like working capital components, but really the full functionality of driving out a fully integrated income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow is the sweet spot of strategic modeling, and that's really where it adds the value. So a couple different things in the focus areas then.
Sorry, Ryan, just one other question. When I think about the strategic modeling thing, or the scenario planning that you referenced within the modeling, so if I have a place I do the planning, and it is, we run these roll forwards, we do a one-time bottoms-up plan to set a marker. After that, I could imagine within this module, you do some scenario planning on it, and you can go in lots of different directions. Is it possible to have, like, each of those scenarios, what's the word, like frozen as another set of reference? So it's because the way that we end up doing this, it's not like we're doing lots of scenarios in all different directions off of one baseline, but we're kind of incrementing going forward, where we end up having, and just for perspective, I end up having conversations now where I'm talking about the October 10th case, or the October 12th case, or the October 26th case, and they all have, and so I guess yes is the answer to that question. Like, you can freeze each of these different things.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's really more along the lines of what we call a reference as versioning versus scenarios. So as you complete an October forecast or a plan, as an example, you then can archive that off as kind of an isolated, stored, version of your plan that you can always revert back to, do variance analysis on, and all that sort of thing. So scenarios would be more so in a specific point in time, I want to see an upside, a downside, and a base case. But then when I'm completed with that, I archive that whole thing off and I can look at all of my scenarios within my October plan, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a combination of scenario modeling, which is kind of all at one point in time, different what if analysis type of capabilities, and then more of a versioning that would be a frozen point in time reference that you save back and you can refer back to and do variance analysis on.
Okay, thanks. I'll let you get a little further now. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. And I'll show some of that when I actually get to the scenario manager. I'll highlight that again, and also talk a little bit about how leveraging the S-based side of ETVCS to do that sort of archiving, the reporting and variance analysis is really a value-added prop that is connected with strategic modeling. So I'll highlight that again. So a couple of just quick things in terms of what the purpose-built functionality of strategic modeling is really meant for. It can be summarized really in these 4 quadrants here. The top left is more of the traditional long-term planning, or what I often refer to as just the core financial modeling that can be extended out to a longer-term planning horizon. So we're not just limited to focusing on the next 12 to 24 months, which is often the focus of something like Hyperion Planning on-prem or something within the financials business process, but we can actually extend that modeling out for a longer planning horizon. Oftentimes it's 3 to 5 years, but we've gone out as far as 50 years for things like life of mine analysis at mining companies as an example. But the key here is this is more traditional organic modeling of the business, and whether it's typically going to be driver based because we're having a smaller group of users that are generating these financial statements. So we're not doing a ton of data entry, right? We're not expanding this tool set out to hundreds of people that are entering in their cost center level data. We're utilizing drivers to actually generate the financial statements. And then we can leverage and change forecast methods on the fly, consolidate different business units or regions up into a consolidated model, and then see the impact on the overall financial statements as for a company as a whole, or as at a specific business unit or child entity level of detail as well. So that's really more the core organic financial modeling that's referenced there in the top left. The bottom left is more the inorganic side of the house, or the corporate development type activities. This would cover M&A analysis, large projects or joint ventures, valuation activities. Sometimes things like goodwill impairment testing is done within strategic modeling. And again, because all those things require full set of financial statements. You can't do an acquisition type analysis without looking at the balance sheet of the company or target you're looking to acquire. And how are you going to fund that sort of target? So that's more the inorganic side of the house in the bottom left. Bottom right is the treasury analysis side. So looking at how are you going to fund all this activity, whether it be organic or inorganic. Looking at capital structure, debt covenants, credit ratings, modeling out those debt instruments or equity issuances, as well as things like share buybacks, dividend policy, all those type of activities. So this is, again, a key thing that really doesn't exist in the traditional budgeting application, like a Hyperion Planning on-premise or within the financials module. You'd have to do a lot of custom build activity to try and get this type of thing in place. And still you'd fall a little bit short when it comes to something like the funding routine, which is a piece of functionality I'll highlight in the demonstration. And on the top right-hand side here, we have really the power of the ad hoc scenario capability. So the ability for any user to run a scenario on the fly, do things like goal seeks to look for desired outcomes, and then also run what we call business cases across your entire consolidation structure. If you have a number of business units or regions or entities underneath your parent, to be able to mix and match scenarios to develop an overall business case. Because as we know, it's not always all upside or all downside. We might have a very unique scenario at one specific place in my organizational structure, and then I want to mix and match that with different scenarios that are happening other places in the organization. So I'm going to highlight a little piece of all of these different things throughout the demonstration, but this is really the key in terms of how strategic modeling fits in the mix here with the rest of the planning functionality to really round out the full offering. Okay, so now I'm going to actually jump into a demonstration. So for those of you that were on a week ago or so, some of this is obviously going to be repeat, but hopefully you'll get some new nuggets seeing it here a second time. And I'm going to start by showing the web interface. So obviously this is a cloud tool. So one of the interfaces and the options for you to work with the solution is through the web interface. So I've just logged into my pod here, my ETVCS pod. And the first thing you'll notice is you have all these what we call cards. And each one of these cards really represents a different piece of functionality within the application. And some of these are business processes in and of themselves. So you see here the financials, business process, projects, capital, workforce. Others are more admin type activity that you can use to like do data integration or reports or monitor the application as a whole, modify dimensions and that sort of stuff. But these little cards here can be configured to meet your needs as a specific user. So they're going to be guided by security. You won't be able to see things that you shouldn't have access to. And then you can configure the screen to actually just show what's important to you, what you really want to focus on. So for our demonstration, we're going to focus on the strategic modeling one. And I'm going to open up what we call our consolidation view. And this is going to bring up a consolidation structure within strategic modeling. Okay, so I'm going to open up group consolidation here. And what this is I have a number of different consolidation structures in this screen. And this is the ability to build out different types of roll-ups in your organization. So I had a number of different ones for different demonstrations. This one is focused on what we call group consolidated. And underneath this here is we have different financial models or entities with underneath group consolidated. So each one of these represent a full financial model within strategic modeling. So I have the ability to build a full income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow at each one of these levels of detail. Now, the nice thing is I don't have to do full financials at every level. So sometimes at the lower level in your consolidation structure, it might just be a focus on income statement or maybe some working capital type activities. And then the treasury function might be centralized up here at the top level. And you can pick and choose where you do that type of level. So it doesn't always have to be a bottoms up roll up. You can actually do modeling at the top level as well. And that's one of the benefits of how it's set up as part of the structure, the behind the scenes structure of strategic modeling is not the traditional multidimensional database that has some limitations from that perspective. It's a little bit different than that, which allows that capability. What I just did here is I flipped my business case back to base, and that's going to reference then what scenario am I contributing to that overall consolidated set of financial statements. So you can see right here, they're all base case. I also have a little bit more information over here on the right. I can see my consolidation method as well as my ownership percentage. Yep, go ahead.
Pardon me, Brian. For example, the base case, would this, to what I was saying before, if in the actual planning module we roll up a full set of financials, does it then get, or can it then get fed into here as the base case? Is that the connection?
Absolutely. Yep. So there's direct integration between Hyperion Planning on-premise. We can do a ground to cloud integration, either through FDMEE or through what we call cloud data management, which is the cloud version of the tool that comes with EPBCS. And we would essentially take any information that you wanted to source from Hyperion Planning, or maybe if you have information coming from HFM for actuals as an example, we would source that information and then bring it directly into the base case as a starting point for our data inside of strategic modeling. Now, what I would typically see is actuals would be kind of full financial statements, right? We'd have all the actuals, which are maybe coming out of HFM, or maybe you brought them into your planning application already. On the planning side, normally what we'd see is we'd have a subset of the financial statements that would be coming from Hyperion Planning, because we would actually be wanting to generate the rest of the financial statements, like the treasury activity as an example, would typically be generated inside of strategic modeling. So we'd pull at least partial data out of Hyperion Planning to feed into strategic modeling, and then we would round out the rest of the financial statements to complete the overall picture. Does that make sense?
It does. I don't know if we would do it that way, but I know what you mean. The thing I'm wondering is the data we're pulling in this example from the planning side, is it the full balance sheet data and then the cash flow mapping and cash flow statement creation happens in here, or do we pull the cash flow statement out of planning as a, you get what I mean?
That's a good question. Yeah. That's more, it's more of a design consideration. What I typically would say though is we don't want to replicate functionality, right? We don't want to build two cash flow statements and then have to reconcile them. So typically what we look at and we'd say, okay, where is the right place to actually generate the cash flow statement? And 9 times out of 10, if you have HSF and and Hyperion Planning, or strategic modeling and planning, strategic modeling is a better place to generate the full financial statements because there's more functionality in it than what sits in Hyperion Planning today from a full financial statement perspective. So now it's not to say we couldn't. If you guys said, hey, we've built out our full balance sheet and cash flow, it works perfectly, that's where we want it to be, we just want to use strategic modeling to do scenarios, then we certainly could just pull in the full set of financial statements and allow you to tweak assumptions, right? Like pull in your full balance sheet and then have it say, okay, the original assumption for days on sales was 60 days. I want to modify it to 45 and see what the impact on my financial statements look like. So that would certainly be an option, but it's just not the typical approach that we see. Okay,
and the thing I'm thinking about in this question is, you know, like with your example of day sales outstanding and using that to drive things, I'm thinking about the scenario planning activity or you were calling it the versions, I think.
The version control, yep.
That being like a flow-based adjustment, right? Because all the planning is done on a balance sheet level. We're doing balance changes that then yields a cash flow. But then when we get into scenario planning, I don't want to be playing with balance changes again that have to be backed into to produce a flow that then produce a DSO number. I know it's all related, but I want to see if you know how it would work to have a bottoms up done on a balance sheet roll forward basis, but then have scenario planning done as a function of flow changes only, which then behind the scenes are converted into balance changes, which are then used to produce these metrics or you know, connect between like the DSO as you were using as an example. I mean, it's all just math, but right now we're doing it all in you know, a myriad of Excel sheets and well, that's what I'm trying to avoid. But I don't, is that, do you get what I'm saying? And is that something that's possible where, okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think when I jump into the entity here and when I get to the Excel interface, let's revisit that and talk a little bit more specifically about how we could set up the forecast methods inside of SM to accommodate that, right? To be able to say, okay, I've started with a bottoms up detailed view of this balance sheet account. I've loaded that. Now, how do I want to interact with that account from a scenario perspective? So we'll kind of come back and revisit that as we open up a specific model. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's good. And Maggie, Kevin, are you guys with me? What I'm thinking about is just, okay. Thanks, Sean. Okay.
No worries. Good questions. So just a couple other things to round out just the functionality here on the consolidation structure. I just wanted to mention that you do have the capability to do more than just a straight aggregation. There really is true consolidation functionality in here as well, as referenced by here. You can see my consolidation method for this region was set up as equity method and 25%. It doesn't just do a simple roll up. It'll actually know in this case to take 25% of earnings from investments or net income on the income statement, roll it up into an earnings from investments line on the income statement at the group consolidated level, as well as generate the balance sheet asset that's going to increase by those earnings and decrease by any distributions that are sent from the EMEA region. So there's financial intelligence within each one of these entities, as well as financial intelligence within the overall consolidation structure, which is pretty powerful. The last thing here is really just I wanted to mention the ability to mix and match these scenarios. And this is done by business case. So as an example here, if I flip my base case from base to upside, you'll see that it just flips all these here to upside. But I can do more than that. I can mix and match these as well. For example, you can see right now I have this target blue entity down here. This is an acquisition. This is a potential M&A target that I'm looking at right now. It's part of my upside scenario, part of my base case as well. I could run a scenario that says, well, I want to exclude that target. So now I'm not playing around with individual scenarios, but I'm simply including or excluding an acquisition target. So in this case, I've excluded it. I could also then run a separate scenario that says, well, what if I want to include it, but I don't want to just include the base. I want to actually include some synergies as well in that target. So now you can see a combination of base case, upside for a couple of regions here, as well as a synergy scenario with this acquisition target. So a lot of flexibility to model individual scenarios at a child entity level, including and excluding entities from a scenario perspective, and then mixing and matching these things to generate an overall business case. In this case, it's called the with synergies business case that would generate then the full set of financials that would be reported on. So a lot of flexibility from that perspective. All right, so now I'm going to open up one of the entities here, and I'm going to start in the web just to show some of that interface, and then I'm going to jump into the Excel interface to really highlight the majority of the functionality in there instead. So here I've opened up an income statement view inside of this financial model. And so I can organize my group of financial statements or my different accounts and drivers by what we call account groups. That's what this section is here. So you can see right now I'm filtered on income statement, but I also can filter on balance sheet, different levels of detail here. And then I can look at actually how do I drive these things? How do I forecast them, and how are these numbers being generated? And I can do that in a number of different ways. This web interface, as you probably can tell, is meant to mimic a little bit more familiar, be a little bit more familiar with what you have in the planning world with like a web form. And so that's kind of the look and feel of this. And I can interact with the data similarly. So if I wanted to see, how is my revenue being generated here in 2020, I can click on this action button, click on the audit trail. It's going to pull up a little pane over here on the right-hand side, and it's going to provide me with a worded description as well as a numeric description of how the account's being forecasted. So you can see here, net operating revenues is just operating revenues minus discounts and returns. If I want to analyze deeper on that, I can see all of this is being generated based on my consumer product revenue. And consumer product revenue is being driven with a volume times the price. So I can actually get down all the way to my drivers. If I want to go even further, I could drill into volume. I could see this is being forecasted as a growth rate. I could say instead of a 7% growth rate, maybe I change that back to 6%. And I calculate my model. And it gives me a nice little feature here. You can see that it highlights all these different pieces in yellow. What it's really indicating is by changing that one volume growth rate in 2020, it had an impact on all these other outputs in my financial model. Now it makes sense because if I change volume growth in 2020, my volume growth is obviously going to be impacted in the out years. That's going to change revenue from all my time periods. And then when I get to something like cost of sales, that is set up as a % of revenue. So labor costs and O&M, all those pieces are driven off of my revenue forecast. So I can see that those have been impacted as well by changing that volume growth rate. So pretty nice little feature. This was something they kind of pulled from the planning world. That's net new with strategic modeling because of the web interface and being able to have that sort of traffic lighting type of indicator as you change the model and update forecast methods. You can also do a lot of forecasting directly in the system. So if I look at something like cost of sales, I'm going to do labor costs as a starting point. Instead of looking at the audit trail here, I'm going to actually open up the forecast method. So the forecast method is how are we actually driving this output? And again, think of this as how are we doing it directly inside of SM, because you might have a lot more detail that's sitting in your planning world, right? So if you think of labor costs coming from Hyperion Planning, you might have, probably have departments or cost center level of detail, a ton of detail that's actually being used to build up the overall labor costs that you then get to a final number for the company or for the business unit. But when we bring that into strategic modeling, we identify how do you want to model that specifically inside of here. And for this one, it's set up as a, go ahead.
I'm sorry, for this as an example, is all of this stuff that you're showing here user defined in the, so I'm not as familiar with how the planning is done in the income statement here, but if it's, is it all these different like variables that are being used to produce the estimate, are they all just user defined and then they flow through however we did it? Or is it like, okay, you run a short cycle make to stock business, here are the attributes that are typical for your business as a starting point? Or no, actually you run a long cycle, heavily customized, capital intensive business, it's going to look more like this. And here's a starting point of variable.
Yeah, so there's a starting point. So when you open up a blank model from strategic modeling, it's going to have a number of just default out of the box forecast methods. They're going to be simple things like this, like % of revenue as an example, or a year-over-year growth rate, or on the AR side, it would be days on sales. So they'll have what we call a standard forecast method. That's what I'm showing right here. And that's going to be what it starts with. But then if you want to build in more detailed, unique drivers that are specific to your business, that you have the full flexibility to do that. So that's what part of the implementation would be, is identifying, what drivers do you need to actually drive the financial statements. And then those would be set up because you have a whole host of accounts that you can build completely from scratch that you would use then to actually drive your financial statements in a unique manner. So you're not limited to just these out of the box standard forecast methods. You can build detailed ones as well.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay. So in this example here, set up as a basic % of sales. If I were to import my data from Hyperion Planning, what the model is going to do, it's going to say, okay, in this case, I needed to get to $90 million in labor costs. It would import that $90 million, look at the forecast method that I have set up inside of strategic modeling, and then back into the driver that it needs to use in order to hit that output. So like in this case, if we had loaded that information from Hyperion Planning, we had already built this bottoms-up detailed view of labor costs in Hyperion Planning. It would simply accept the output as a result, and then back into the necessary driver in order to get there. And that way, from that point on, you have the ability to then tweak that driver any way you want for scenario purposes. So in a base case, you could say, okay, I've loaded this from Hyperion Planning. My implied labor costs were 16% of revenue. But what if I think that's going to change to 17% or 13%? Then what impact does it have on my financial statements? So that's the important thing about defining forecast methods within SM is how do you want to actually run your scenario analysis? Do you want to use something like percent of sales or a DSO number to drive the balance? Or do you just want to change the dollars, right? Change the balance from 50 to 100 or something along those lines. That's what you would define, and then that's what you would be allowed to manipulate as part of your scenario analysis.
So, hey, this is Barrett Kirk. The question I have is like, so if we take labor costs because it's our current example, we understand labor costs as an input into our rates either in the factory or in the field or in the shop, and that would obviously, if we're saying, hey, our field labor costs are going to go up by $2 per hour in this region, that would flow into at a bottoms up level a scenario that we could plan, say, in the PFP space. So help me understand the difference in mentality around running a scenario with your bottoms up as you build out your, say, project financial planning versus here in strategic modeling.
Sure. If you would hang on just for a little bit, I'm going to go through a scenario example, and if you could, I'll come back to that to try and draw a comparison between scenarios that are done in more the bottoms up view in the planning world and in the PFP world versus how we do them in SM. So if you could hold on just for probably like 5 minutes, it'll make a little bit more sense if I follow it in the flow of that scenario example. So would that be okay if I just hold on to that for a minute?
Yeah, you're going to get to cool.
Yeah, I'll come back to it for sure. And if I don't address it fully, just interrupt me again there, and we'll make sure we cover it. But I think we'll cover it when we get there.
Quicker one before that is do you have orders in here?
Say that again.
Is orders a data element that's included in? Like, I don't know if you'd have it in the income statement or the cash flow or where it would be, but is that a metric that's planned for in here?
Now that'd be something that you would define, because it's something that would be a unique, element that we need to make sure we account for. So that would be something that we would build in from a financial modeling perspective. So we certainly could have it. It's just not part of the default out of the box financial statement.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. And that's important to note. I should have mentioned this in terms of the financial chart of accounts. This is also completely configurable. So you see one level of detail here with like revenue being broken down between product revenue, consumer business services. My cost of sales is labor, O&M, variable costs. This is something that we define to match your chart of accounts. You guys obviously already have a chart of accounts. You have one that you're using with Hyperion Planning today. We would look at that as a reference point and then pick a certain level of detail. It usually wouldn't be all of the chart of accounts that you have in planning, because the purpose of this is to be a little bit higher level so that you can manage it and manipulate things in a little bit more global macro perspective as opposed to all the detailed bottom stuff. But we would fit that chart of accounts in with what you have in Hyperion Planning so that we could easily integrate the data and then also be able to run the scenarios and kind of do a comparison of tops down versus bottoms up. Okay. So in terms of forecast methods, there's a lot of forecast methods that are out of the box, just basic standard ones. We talked about percent of sales already, but we also could do simple inputs, growth rate, year-over-year growth rate. Here are the days and the turns on the balance sheet side for something like AR or inventory. Multiples as well. If you have things like a dividend that's a dollar per share, those are pretty common. But oftentimes we also get to forecast methods that don't fit into one of those out-of-the-box things. So something like consumer product revenues as an example. This is a volume times a price. So there is no volume times price out of the box forecast method that you can pick in a drop down. So that's where you come and you can actually build what we call free-form formulas. So if I go in here to this edit box, this is something, again, that the end users have full flexibility to change and do on their own. And it's really very simple. It's just learning syntax, very much like Excel. The only difference really is instead of instead of cell references here, we have account numbers. So you can see this is account number 300. That just happens to be the volume account. If I search over here to the right, I can search for volume and you can see it's right there. And then I have a multiplier and times the average price, which is my average price account number 305. So it's simply mimicking the Excel world, only I'm doing it by account number instead of cell reference. And you build a forecast method really for your entire planning horizon as opposed to by cell. And this really is a huge advantage in terms of trying to make sure the integrity of your model stays intact. Because when you think about the Excel world, the only way to truly audit an Excel model is to go cell by cell by cell by cell to make sure somebody hasn't put in a +10 at the end of a forecast method or things like that. Whereas in the strategic modeling world, we define a forecast method for the account, and then that applies to the entire planning horizon. And if you have some unique condition that says in the first year I do one thing and the second year I do something else, then you can simply use conditional formulas like if statements to build that in, and those work exactly like they would in Excel. If this whole statement holds true, do one thing. If it is false, do another. So really full flexibility to build any sort of forecast method you want. I've been working with this tool in the on-prem and the cloud version now for about 15 years, and I've yet to run into an Excel formula that I couldn't replicate in some way, shape, or form inside of strategic modeling. So if you have a unique driver that you need to use or a forecast method that you need to build in, we can do that as part of this free-form forecast method.
Quick question. So whatever you are showing today, is that all out-of-box functionalities from Oracle EPBS strategic module? Or is that something that you guys have customized and build a solution out of it?
No, it's all out-of-the-box functionality. I don't ever call it customization. The configuration is just the unique chart of accounts and or like the forecast method. So like this volume times price is a formula that was built or configured, but it's not changing any code. It's not customizing anything like that. And it's a lot more straightforward than even something like a calc script or a business rule. This is more akin to just changing a formula in an Excel spreadsheet is basically what it is.
Yeah, this is similar.
I'm not showing
to what
anything.
we've done with CSV.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Sure thing. So I'm just going to highlight a little bit in the Excel interface so I can talk a little bit more about specifically, I'll get to the scenario functionality and focus a little bit more on the balance sheet cash flow as well. So when I jump into the Excel interface here, you can see I'm just sitting in a normal Excel spreadsheet, but now I have this strategic modeling ribbon here on the top that I can access all my strategic modeling functionality. And what you'll notice here is what I'm showing as an income statement report, but it's unique in the sense that when I look at something like gross profit here in 2019, you see I don't have my cell reference, right? I don't see the formula, what would it be, H14 minus H20 to generate my gross profit. And the reason for that is because all that accounting integrity, all the data, all the forecast methods, the pre-built integrated financial statement logic is stored on what we call the account view tab. That's where all the logic is centrally placed. And then I'm simply viewing the information over here on the report. Seems very simple, but it eliminates one of the biggest errors with Excel spreadsheets, which is simple linking from one tab to the next, right? If I needed to drive something on my balance sheet off the income statement in the Excel world, you're linking it back to the other tab, or you're linking it to other workbooks, and that just can cause some pain points in terms of maintenance. In addition, if you want to look at how something's being driven, instead of having the colored boxes pop up in your screen or the arrows fly across your screen with the trace precedence, you have the audit trail capability in here as well in the Excel interface. So again, this is our way to view how is this account being forecasted. Gross profit in this case is operating revenues minus cost of sales. I can see that worded description and numeric description. In the Excel interface, it's actually a little bit even more intuitive because I can drill forward and backward very easily. So I can drill all the way to that volume times price formula here, or I can go backwards the other way. So very easy, making the model a lot more transparent. If you're ever questioning a number and output, very quickly coming to this audit trail, navigating through it, and then seeing how it's being generated is a very quick way to kind of get to the bottom of any questions that may be coming up in terms of how the financial statements were generated. If I jump over to the balance sheet here real quick. So at this level, in this model that I'm focusing on here, it's more of the working capital level of detail. And so this might have come from Hyperion planning in this case. So let's take something like accounts receivable. You may have had a situation where you built up that accounts receivable balance in a roll forward schedule at a very detailed level by department, by cost center, inside Hyperion planning. And we say that's great, and we can take that information directly from Hyperion planning, import that here into strategic modeling, and then it'll generate the output accordingly. All we have to do is simply define how do you want it to be forecasted? How do you want that model inside of SM to generate the balance? And so if to your point earlier, if you had something where you just wanted to say the only thing I want to do inside of SM is manipulate the flows, like take the change, like I can see in here, this for inventory as an example, I'm going from 143 to 162, so about a $20 million change from one year to the next. If you wanted your ability from a scenario perspective to simply change that number, and instead of it being a $20 million change, you want to change it to 25 million, then you would simply set up your forecast method to be a change in actual value, so that your input then becomes that physical change. You would change it from 20 to 25. Whereas this model that I have right now is set up more with a driver-based view. So in this case, it's set up, the inventory is set up as turns, so turns on cost of sales. So if I would again imported this inventory balance from Hyperion planning, it would look at it and say, okay, I need 162 million in the year 2020. My forecast method inside of strategic modeling is set up as a turns on cost of sales. The cost of sales number is 340 million. That's what's being generated on my income statement. So the model initially would back into the 2.1 turn number for you in order to get to that output that you imported from Hyperion planning. At that point then, when you start to run scenarios, you can change this driver.
And Ryan, what I was thinking about is doing this one step removed from this, where on the summary CF tab, presumably there's an inventory line, and if on that line you make that instead of 2040, it then reverse engineers the balance sheet and then reverse engineers the turns implied, all from that change from the 20 to the 40.
Yeah, we're basically speaking the same language. The difference here is that from a cash flow perspective, the cash flow in strategic modeling is always an output. It's always an output. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that you can't manipulate what's showing up on the cash flow. So let me just show you a real example of this. So if I flip into my cash flow statement, I look at my change in working capital here in 2020. I can see here that my change in working capital is 28.6 million. Well, how is that being generated? I go to my audit trail. I can see it's coming from all these different places. Okay. So here's all my different places. I'm going to pick prepaid expenses because I think this one is already set up the way that I want. So if I look at prepaid expenses, it's set up and it's saying my change is 2.7 million. Okay, so that's my change in prepaid expenses. I'm going to go back to my balance sheet real quick and look at prepaid expenses. So here you can see from 19 to 20, there you can see that 2.7 million. If I go to my forecast method here, okay, so this one actually I thought it would maybe be set up as a change. It's set up as a change based on a percent. I'm going to hold with me one more second. I'm going to change the forecast method so I can build a real example of exactly what you're talking about. I'm going to set up this forecast method for prepaid expenses to essentially just forecast the change. And then I'm going to calculate it. So I'm not using a driver. I'm not using a DSO or anything in this case. I'm just saying, what is the change from one period to the next? Calculate the model. And again, this would be something that we would define during the implementation, so you wouldn't have to be changing these things on the fly. It would already be set up the way that you wanted to see it. So here you can see now my prepaid expenses when I changed that forecast method. My last actual period that was loaded was 2017. It was 106 million, and I set this up to forecast the change. And so now the change that I've input right now is just 0. So you can see that this actually just flows through. It stays at 106 million. But if I had loaded this information from planning and I say, okay, planning didn't change it at all for whatever reason, I don't have any change in prepaid expenses, but now I want to actually change this. I want, instead of a 0 change, I want it to be $5 million in terms of a change. I can actually change that right here. I can go into my audit and say, I want a $5 million change in prepaid expenses, put in that 5, recalculate, and then that will go from 106 million to 111 million. Just got to refresh the screen here. Okay, so I went from 106 million to 111 million. The only thing I was doing is I was changing the input from one period to the next. So similarly, if I look at my cash flow statement in 2020, you'll be able to see that $5 million.
Yeah, the thing I'm just trying to get my head around is and of course the mechanics all make sense, and I understand the effect that we're getting is the same. I'm just thinking through the idea that the cash flow statement is always an output. The user will never be interfacing with the cash flow statement view as an input. It's always going to be the balance sheet.
Well, you could build a view, you could build a report that had your inputs being driven off of a cash flow statement type of view. It's just the reality is that you're driving the balance sheet, right? Like the input is the same.
I understand.
The 5 million. Yeah. So we could set up the view so that they're not looking at the balance sheet when they do that. They're looking at more of a cash flow report that's doing it. It's just not how this report was set up. This report was more of an output view. But if you wanted to set up more of a flows, like a sources uses type of view that was your input screen, we could certainly do that. It would just be a report that we would set up accordingly. And then your balance sheet would just be a report that you'd look at as an output. So that'd be perfectly fine. But at the end of the day, our cash flow statement, and this is key because we don't ever want to make inputs directly on the face of the report because that compromises the integrity of the entire funding routine, right? So we always need to make sure that if you manipulate a number from a cash flow perspective, it's really driving the balance sheet, which is then hitting the funding routine to make sure everything balances, right? So it's semantics at the end of the day, but we can build a report to where if your input screen is always from a cash flow perspective, we could certainly have an input screen that would look at it that way instead. Okay. All right, so now I'm on to the scenarios. So now I'm going to try and get back to the question at hand about kind of comparing scenarios in more of the traditional planning world, whether it be PSP or basic planning, and how we think of them inside of strategic modeling. So when I do a scenario inside of strategic modeling, again, what I'm doing is I'm building on top of a base case. So I'm saying I have a base or a starting point. I want to manipulate or change a specific driver or a specific forecast method, and then see the impact that it has on the rest of the financial statements. If you were to do that in a planning world or a PFP world, you basically are copying, right? You're copying a version into a new sandbox, and then you're manipulating the inputs. The problem with that is that if you want to change anything in your base case, you have to then maintain it in two places, right? The same thing in the Excel world. If you had saved a version of your Excel model and saved it as version 2, saved it as version 5, and all of a sudden you see something in version 1 that you wanted to change, you have to make that change in all 5 versions in order for it to be impacted. So it's a little bit more cumbersome. But if the level of detail you need to build the scenario at requires something like a PFP or Hyperion planning, that's fine. We can still accept another scenario that you built in Hyperion planning and pull it into strategic modeling. But the advantage that we have for scenarios in strategic modeling is that we can truly layer individual changes on top of a base case. So like in the example that I'm going to show here, I'm going to call it a CapEx scenario. And I'm going to say in this CapEx scenario, I want to inherit everything from the base case initially. So you can see my inheritance order here. It says start with the base case and then layer on any changes I want for the specific capital scenario. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to select the individual accounts that I want to change. So fixed capital investment is one, and then volume is going to be my other one. I'm going to throw one more other one in here because I want to show you a little bit more detail around goal seek capability. So I'll come back to this here in a second, but this target ROIC is going to be one other one that I'm going to highlight. So I've selected those 3 accounts that I want to change from my base case. Now, again, seems like kind of a small little nuance, but the big thing here is if I change anything else in my base, if I change my labor forecast, if I change my DSO assumption or my accounts payable forecast or whatever it might be, those changes automatically flow through to my CapEx scenario. I only have to maintain these three inputs as a separate, unique variable within the scenario. I'm not maintaining two whole copies or two whole versions of the plan at this point. So it makes it a lot easier to be able to run these scenarios on the fly and maintain them going forward. So you don't have to just play with the sandbox and then delete it right away. You could actually say, you know what, I would always like to see what happens if my revenue growth rate is 2% higher or 2% lower than what was in my original base case. And you could keep those kind of scenarios around rather than blowing them away and having to rebuild them every time you wanted to take a quick look. So before I move on and actually kind of walk through the rest of the scenario, is there more specific question in terms of kind of how the scenario management inside of SM kind of interacts or is different with scenario management in the traditional planning world?
No, that covered it. I kind of get it. I just have reservations knowing how complex our how many product lines and project types that we manage across our portfolio, that our scenarios, you're going to have say, I don't know, that's what I'm trying to figure out, is like it's strategic, but then between our four different major businesses, they each have X number of ways they go to market, and each one of those has its own dynamic. I feel like the number of scenarios you're maintaining is difficult, but maybe I'm just not imagining it correctly.
And it's all about level of detail, right? And it's all about right tool for the right job. So if your scenario is at a project level, then it's not going to be in here. You would do that, in the tool where it makes the most sense. And we're not going to have all your project level detail inside of something like strategic modeling. So you would only really build out scenarios for the drivers and the level of detail that you need at this level to generate, again, a focus more on the financial statement level of detail inside of the model. And those can be different by business unit because you obviously have different drivers, different ways to go to market. But if the level of detail required for the scenario is such that it doesn't fit, then we would still keep that scenario type activity in something like PFT as an example. And we would simply accept the output, accept the results of it. So that's definitely part of the design conversation, is what is the right level of detail? What's that balance? What drivers really make sense? What are you being asked as a finance FP&A person to be able to tweak, right? Because we all know when you build up a bottoms-up forecast method, the only thing you're guaranteed is that the management's not going to like the result, right? You're going to have to change it in some way, shape, or form. And this is a mechanism to be able to potentially do that at a higher level of detail. So that if they say, look, I don't like the fact that our operating income only grew by 2%, I want it to grow by 3%, it doesn't force you to go initially anyway, all the way back down to the weeds and build everything from the bottoms up. I could take a look at it and say, okay, how theoretically can I get from 2% to 3%? Look at the key metrics, the key big variables in the application. Say, all right, it looks like if I tweak, cost of goods sold by this or tweak this area here, I can get there. Use that as a target and then push it back down to the detail to figure out the nuts and bolts of how you actually might get there if it seems reasonable. So there's definitely a reason for it or a purpose.
Yeah, I feel like the scenarios that, like for instance, like if you're going to push your supplier terms strategically across the organization to try to, get 5 days more before we pay a supplier on average, and that's kind of a strategic target, that this would be a tool that where, days to pay is a metric in your model, and then you go into, but then if the sourcing team is really trying to figure out how they're going to actually achieve that target, they're down in a lower level of tool looking at all the suppliers and all the open POs and really trying to figure out how they would execute that particular, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, you nailed it there. I mean, that's a perfect example, because we could look at it and say, look, our payables, on average as a company or as a business unit, the days are too low or they're too high, and payables, you'd probably be saying they're too low. And then saying, all right, well, I want to be able to change that by X number of days. That's a strategic target. But then that might be all well and good. And you say, okay, can we hit, 30 days or 25 days? And the answer to get to the answer to that, you still would have to go back down to the details. But at least you have the capacity in here to say, what is it at the macro level when you roll up all the details? What would it look like if I were to be able to change it, and then go from there?
That's what I was going to ask, is like how, when you have that, so let's say we've done our lower level planning and we're bringing in the output of our plan into strategic modeling. And how do you link, like, the days to pay metric would probably be a pretty critical one in a strategic model. How do you link that to what you did in your plan? I mean, does that mean you've got to go in and do a better job of making sure that is a metric that's exposed at a granular level in your plan so that it can be used as a higher level, slide rule within your strategic model? I mean, you've got to think about how this integrates top to bottom, right?
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily have to. Like if days to pay was the metric that corporate looked at and said that's the important one we want to use, but for whatever reason down at the detail level they were doing it more tactically and it wasn't using that, it was using something else. Even if those were disconnected, you still would be able to see, what is the payables number that I'm generating, and what does that mean for a days to pay output? So I could see what the output was. But then when you go back, the challenge would be, if you're going to force people at the lower level to say you need to hit this number of days to pay, well, that's when you'd have to change process, right? You'd have to go back and say, okay, well, you really need to use this metric to actually drive your output at the lower level, because that's what we're using at the higher level. So that's more of a process question. Technically, you wouldn't have to have them match, because you could choose a different driver at a top down level than you have at a bottom up level. But it might interfere with process discussions if you're talking one language about days to pay, and at the detail level they're talking about something else. So the tool itself doesn't force it, but from a process perspective, there would probably have to be some alignment there.
Okay.
All right, so I'm just going to round out this example here. So I created this scenario, CapEx scenario here, and you see it dropped it into the scenario column for me. And then I go to my account view tab, and this is where I actually can change my numbers and see the output. So in the base case, it populated for me. It was initially 90 million in capital. I'm going to jump that up to 120 million. And I'm going to change my growth rate for volume from 10% to 12%. And I'm going to calculate and then do a little comparison and see what my return on invested capital looks like with that additional 30 million in spend. So I'm going to go back to my scenario variance report. It'll refresh the report for me. You can see originally it was 28.3 was my ROIC. And now I'll see when it refreshes my screen here what my updated ROIC is with that additional 30 million in spend and the 2% increase in my volume growth. All right, so I can see here I'm at 28.2%. So I'm close. You can see over here in the variance column, an additional 30 million in gross fixed assets. There's my additional volume in units based on that 2% growth that I put in my volume output. But I did not hit that base level of ROIC. So if I were to take this example up to management, they might look at it and say, well, we need to hit at least that 28.3 return metric to justify the spend in that capital. So I could go back and do some guessing and checking here, putting in a new growth rate, or I can use a feature like Goal Seek to actually find the answer for me. So I can say I want to set the return on invested capital. In this case, I'm focusing just on one period of 28.3 in the year of 2019 by changing volume. And again, I'm changing that just in 2019. And I'm going to click Seek. And you can see here it's telling me now I need to go up to 12.536 in order to hit that 28.3 metric. And I could click OK and refresh. So I wanted to accept that result. It's going to then push that 12.5 number into my actual assumption, recalculate the model, and then it'll refresh and I'll be at 28.3 here in ROIC. And again, the key to this scenario, the goal seek type analysis, is it all is based off of the drivers that you set up, right? So if you don't have a specific driver like a DSO setup, you can't run a scenario on DSO if DSO isn't driving your model, right? So it's really, that's the key part of our design consideration as we do this is, what are you being asked to manipulate or change inside of your financial model that you want to use as levers to be able to do these type of things? You also have the ability to do multi-series, and this is something I didn't show you last time. I mentioned it, but I didn't show it. So if I wanted to actually do a goal seek on ROIC, not just for 2019, but I wanted to do it for all of my out years from 2019 and beyond, that's where I can do this type of time series and do it across the board. So that's why I set up this target ROIC account. And I could say, I want to set my target ROIC to 29%. And I want to do it not just in 2019, but I actually want to do that for all of my time periods. I want to do it for 2020, 2021, and 2022. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to calculate this. And then I'm going to go back into my goal seek, and I'm going to run a time series goal seek that searches for the volume growth that I need in all of these years in order to hit the proper ROIC. So I'm going to go into my goal seek again, and instead of a single period, I'm going to do a time series. And I say I want to set the values in my return on invested capital. Forgot an R there. So again, I want to set my ROIC metric to the value that is sitting in that target ROIC account that I had set up by changing volume, but I want to do it in this case from 2019 all the way through to the end, 2022. I click seek here. And now it's telling me these are the growth rates that I need in order to hit that 29% marker in all of those years. So really flexibly, it'll do a single period type of goal seek or do a time series. If I click OK again here and refresh, you'll see my volume growth assumptions will all get populated for all 4 years now in order to hit that target ROIC number. So there you can see the required volume growth. Okay. So the key here in this whole model is essentially to point out that I have the full flexibility to build in any forecast method I want, something as simple as a growth rate or a change in actual value from one period to the next, or something that's very complicated, including conditional statements and all that sort of stuff. You can choose whether you're sourcing all the data from an outside system like Hyperion Planning, or you're generating the data itself directly inside of SM. Those are all options that we would just look at and set up as part of the configuration during the implementation horizon. But things like the cash flow statement are automatically generated for you. And actually, as I was answering that question earlier, I forgot to highlight kind of a key differentiator in terms of how the cash flow is done inside of SM. So I want to highlight that real quick before I move on. And that's the ability not just to pull the normal change, right? Not just to generate a cash flow off of the simple change from one period to the next on the balance sheet, but it's intelligent enough to understand that there's different types of changes. So if I look at, if I look at my change in working capital again, and I look at something like inventory, it knows here, you can see I have a change due to acquisition as well as a change due to non-cash activity. So if I had acquired a company with inventory, it knows to take that out of my normal operating change and move that additional inventory that I picked up as part of the acquisition into the investing section as acquired assets. If I had written off inventory for some reason, again, it wouldn't show up as a normal change in working capital. It would show up as a non-cash add back at the top of the cash flow statement. So that financial intelligence is all built in. That's all out of the box, functionality inside of strategic modeling. All right, the last thing I want to show here is just a little bit on the capital structure side. So this is a quick report just to highlight the ability that we have to do valuation type analysis. So this is looking at different segments within the business, the consumer versus commercial versus services segment, and doing a discounted cash flow analysis to identify how much value is being driven by each one of those segments. So this is something, again, using the out-of-the-box financials and simply applying a discount rate to the cash flows gets me to that valuation, essentially an NPV, basically, in terms of each one of these segments. I can also look at things like credit rating. To the question earlier about out-of-the-box versus configuration, this is something that really is configuration, and that's because the credit metrics are different for every company, and they change, quite honestly, on a fairly regular basis in terms of how certain things are defined. Like, for example, even something as simple as EBITDA, when you use EBITDA in terms of these type of metrics, it's almost always adjusted EBITDA, and what is or is not included as part of your calculation may be different than somebody else. So this is something that if it was important to look at something like an average bond rating for GE at a business unit level or at an overall level, we would identify what are those key metrics that you look at, and then also what does the table look like? You know, what equates to a AAA versus a AA? And that's something we set up as part of the implementation process so you can look at this thing. But a lot of value added in something like this, because as you run scenarios, you can see not just does it have an impact on my cash, does it have an impact on my net income, but I can look and see if it has an impact on something like a credit rating and the impact over the course of time, or something like a debt covenant as well. And the last piece of functionality is really to highlight the funding routine. And this is something that you really won't find anywhere out there in terms of other traditional budgeting tools, including Hyperion planning. And that's the ability to essentially identify in every single period in the model whether I'm generating a surplus or a deficit, and allowing the user to specify how I want to handle that, how I want to use a surplus or how I want to fund the deficit in order to balance out my balance sheet. And that's all done through what we call the funding routine. And so you can see here in my example right now, I have cash, and that cash is building up here in the out years. At the same time, I have some debt instruments. You can see I have a couple term debt instruments that aren't due until past my planning horizon. I have another one here that it comes due in 2020, so you can see that drop off here. But I might want to manipulate this funding routine in order to use that cash differently. So I'm going to go again to my strategic modeling tab, open up my funding routine, again, an out-of-the-box utility, and I'm simply going to define the order of operations that I want it to follow. So I'm going to say in this case that in the case of a cash surplus, first right now it's paying down short-term debt, which in this case is a revolving credit facility. And right now it's just immediately then taking any excess over that and putting it into marketable securities. And what I'm going to say now is instead, I want to actually use that cash to pay down 7.5% senior notes. So I'm going to click OK, recalculate the model. And then what you'll see when this refreshes is that it uses this cash here in my cash line to pay down this 7.5% senior notes and then rebalance the balance sheet. So now you can see my cash drop significantly. You can see I could pay off the majority of that 7.5% senior note by this time period, and then it's all gone in this next one. But I now have a whole new capital structure. And it's not just as simple as balancing the balance sheet. I obviously have interest rates that are tied to each of these debt instruments. I'm generating interest income off my cash balance. All those things are generating a net new interest expense on my income statement, which in fact will affect taxes, all of which then impact my cash flow. So it's a very circular problem inside of the financial statements that is all solved through the funding routine. Essentially, that is solving all the iterations. It's running through iterations behind the scenes and solving for the circularity between income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow to make sure you get to a balanced state on your balance sheet. So you don't have to worry about plugging in things like interest or taxes because of the circular references anymore. It just automatically works as part of the funding routine. So it definitely has huge value added benefit and something that really doesn't exist at all in the Hyperion planning world. So when I mentioned earlier that the financials business process is really focused more on doing working capital type balance sheet activities if necessary, this is one of the reasons why. Trying to build in an intelligent funding routine into Hyperion planning would be extremely difficult and costly, whereas you have it inside of strategic modeling entirely out of the box without any customization or configuration required. So a lot of value added on that side. All right. So that's really the end of a demonstration perspective. I just want to do a quick summary in terms of what some of the key value propositions are. The first and foremost, it really is a tool that's meant and built for fully integrated financial statements. So generating the full balance sheet and cash flow, including all of the financing activity out of the box as opposed to being configured. It has accounting integrity built in, so you don't need to worry about things like the balance sheet balancing, the change in accounts receivable flowing through the operating section of the cash flow. All that stuff is ingrained in the tool and cannot be broken. And it's a tool that's specifically built for end users to do modeling, to run different drivers through the system, build forecast methods, and actually generate financial statements in a true modeling fashion, as opposed to a data entry or data-centric approach that's driven by a large number of users. Secondly, is flexibility for the end users. It's something that's meant for the finance team to own and operate. They're the ones that change forecast methods. They're the ones that build scenarios, and they're able to do that without IT involvement. It's not coding. It's not database type scripting. None of that stuff exists within strategic modeling. It's truly the ability to think about it as if it was an Excel model, translate it into the forecast method inside of SM, and run with it on an as-needed basis. Scenario capabilities, the ability to mix and match scenarios. I mentioned that briefly with the business case concept, as well as create those new scenarios on the fly. You don't have to think of all the scenarios in advance. Something could come up last minute. you can create that new scenario and run it on an as-needed basis. And then the treasury utilities is the last thing that I highlighted, the funding routine and the debt modeling. I wanted to leave some time here, so I didn't actually show the debt scheduler functionality, but there's a wizard that you can enter in terms of individual debt instruments, and it automatically generates the financial aspect of that debt instrument for you as well. So a lot of additional detail there from a treasury perspective. So the last thing I'll say before I open it up to any questions is that this all is, as I've highlighted a couple times, completely integrated with the Hyperion planning side of the house, or HFM from a data perspective. Also, as part of EPBCS, within that EPBCS module, you have custom plan types that you can utilize for both modeling and reporting. So what we always do here in this case is we'll take the entire strategic modeling data set and we'll integrate that with the overall reporting cube. So if you wanted to do true multidimensional slicing and dicing type of reporting, you can leverage that functionality inside of EPBCS as well. So you're not just sitting within the individual strategic modeling entities. You can actually leverage all of the reporting tools, the dashboarding, the financial reports on top of that strategic modeling data set by having that data fit in a reporting cube within EPBCS as well. All right. So I think that brings me pretty much to the end of what I wanted to cover. So I'll just kind of open it up and see if there's any further questions, comments, feedback.
Hey, Ryan, this is Kevin.
Yep.
Can you show us how this ties back into S-Base? I think you showed on our last demo how you can utilize this information by showing it to S-Base.
Yeah, let me just pull it up real quick. So essentially all it is the integration side of the house. You're just exporting the data back to a BSO cube, a plan type that sits within EPBCS. And that's what I have up here. So what I have is a SmartView connection. I'm not connected directly to my strategic modeling entities anymore. I'm actually connected to what we call, and in this case, it's this group reporting cube. So it's a database, a true multi-dimensional S-based database within EPBCS that now houses all of my strategic modeling data. So when I want to interact with that, I don't have to be in the entity itself. I can interact with it. Got to refresh here and connect. I can interact with it more in a multi-dimensional database type of format. So I'm going to go in here, and now that I'm refreshed and connected, I can just do true double-clicking, drag and drop type stuff. So if I wanted to build a similar report to what I had in that scenario comparison, I could do things like take my scenario here, drop it into the column, and build out a true, flexible slicing and dicing type of report. And this is all built on top of S-Base. So you're really leveraging best of both worlds: strategic modeling for the true hardcore, calc engine behind the scenes, but then S-Base for all the slicing, dicing, and value of the multidimensional reporting. Is that what you wanted to see, Kevin?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Perfect. Yep. Sorry, I had forgotten about that, and I know I showed that last time. So thanks for reminding me. Any other questions out there? I know we got about 15 minutes still left that we had blocked off. So I'm certainly willing and able to help answer, or we can just kind of talk a little bit about next steps. Do you guys have any thoughts about that as well?
Yeah, I've got a quick question. So obviously you focused on the benefits and the use case. What do you see as limitations or reasons why you wouldn't use this tool versus another?
Sure. So one of the key things is, and the common question on this is, when would you use planning versus strategic modeling? That's the most common one I get. And the answer there, it really comes down to a couple of different things. The first one is level of detail. So strategic modeling is meant to be a higher level of detail. We never have things like cost center inside of strategic modeling. We don't have project dimensions that have all projects in it. We don't have things like SKU level detail or detailed customer level of detail inside the application. So oftentimes asking what level of detail is required is the first step to identify, is something like Hyperion planning a better fit, or is strategic modeling a better fit? So that's kind of a first one in terms of a differentiator. Second thing, it comes down to out of the box functionality. So when I look at something like modeling out debt, as an example, modeling out debt instruments. Now, you could go through and build in a lot of custom logic through business rules and calc scripts and try and replicate essentially a debt instrument inside of Hyperion planning. But why would you do that if you have a debt scheduler inside of strategic modeling that just does it automatically for you out of the box? So looking at which tools have out of the box functionality is typically the second thing that we look at to figure out if it's a better fit. So level of detail side, if somebody comes to me and says, look, I have to do this at the department level, at the cost center level, I have to push them to Hyperion planning immediately. It just is not going to fit from a level of detail perspective inside of strategic modeling. But if they come and say, look, it's really just business unit level of detail at a financial statement level chart of accounts, then I can say, all right, well, strategic modeling seems like it could be a good fit. Let's start to then dig a little bit further. You know, are you focused only on income statement, or do you need to look at full balance sheet cash flow? And that's kind of how the conversation starts to evolve. So level of detail, out of the box functionality. Another thing is number of users is another indicator typically. If you're trying to spread this out to, dozens or hundreds of planners, strategic modeling is typically not the right fit, because this is meant to be a tool that's more closely held to the vest with the FP&A group versus being disseminated across, a large number of users that are controlling just a small piece of the financial statement. So typically, if somebody would come to me and say, hey, I have, 100 people that are entering in their information for their operating expenses, but I also want to be able to take a little bit higher level view of things and run some scenarios on it, I'd say, okay, that's great. Well, why don't we use Hyperion planning to gather all of the data input from those 100 different users? We'll then take that information that's being generated in Hyperion planning, integrate that into strategic modeling at a higher level of detail, and then now my 2 or 3 people at the top that are looking at the analysis can look at it in that strategic modeling view to play around with scenarios at the higher level and do some top-down type of analysis. So those are kind of some of the key things in terms of differentiators that we look at. The last thing I guess I'll mention is reporting. So strategic modeling on a standalone basis, because it has more of a flat file backend, it's not a multi-dimensional database. The reporting in it is somewhat limited. It's basically limited to the type of reports that I showed here, right? Basic financial statement type reports that you define, you build, you set them up, and they just kind of stay static. It is not meant for slicing and dicing ad hoc type reporting capabilities. And that's why when it comes to true management type reporting, we export the data set back out into Essbase so we can do this type of reporting. So that's another strength of the Hyperion planning Essbase tool set that is, a much better fit for this type of analysis and reporting capability versus the strategic modeling tool.
Sounds good. Appreciate that. One other question in thinking about the design. So it's a pre-built design. So I guess one of the key aspects of implementation would be the mapping of our current environment to the preset design, right?
Yep. So at a high level, so like when you get an implement or a model from SM out of the box, let's just take the income statement for an example. It comes with 1 line of revenue, 1 line of cost of sales, 1 line of SG&A. And so what we do then during the implementation is say, okay, well, what are the details underneath the total revenue that you want to see inside of SM, and how do they line up with the details that you have in Hyperion planning? Because more often than not, we're not going to have all of the accounts that you have in Hyperion planning, but we want to make sure we pick a level of detail that makes sense so it's a natural integration point, right? A natural roll-up. In certain circumstances, it comes that there's just a unique perspective, at FP&A that wants to see a roll-up in a very unique way that doesn't really apply to Hyperion planning. And if that comes to be, we can handle that through either mapping from the integration side, or you can build an alternate roll-up in planning so you have that unique roll-up and then integrate directly with that. So it can be handled a number of different ways. But absolutely kind of defining what that chart of accounts needs to look like and then mapping it is a core part of the design session during implementation.
And then how about flexibility and dimension set? Is it a static preset dimension set, or does it have some flexibility, like maybe a few user-defined dimensions?
That's a good question. So there's some of them that are set: account, scenario, time. Those are the ones that are set. We can add additional dimensionality. There's actually a unique dimension inside of here. If I go to this maintenance section, I'm not in a strategic modeling entity. So if I go here, I have the concept of a dimension inside of SM, so I can create new ones. I could create like a product as an example. So I can have unique ones in here. They're a little bit different in the sense of it's not a true, SM is not a multidimensional database. So really what dimensions are in the SM world is applying a more account level detail. So right, if we had a product dimension that we wanted to tie to volume as an example, I would say, okay, take my product dimension, assign it to volume, and now I can see my volume by product. So I guess the short answer to your question is yes, you have the flexibility to add additional dimensions. Essentially though, it's the back end is a little bit different because you are just assigning a dimension level of detail to account, and then you map the data in. And then if you want to do the slicing and dicing of reporting stuff, that's where you'd do it really more in this type of environment where it could be a true dimension.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay. Well, hopefully this was helpful, and even for those of you that saw it the first time, maybe you got a little bit more out of it. Do you guys have any thoughts on what next steps might be in terms of kind of your process to evaluate this, or what else you might need from us to help make the picture clearer?
Yeah, this is Eric. I'm going to talk about, we've been on mute back and forth here talking amongst ourselves about, we could use this, we cannot use that, or this is good, this is bad. So we're going to marinate on some of those things a little bit, and then probably connect back with, I know Barrett, you're on. I know there's a couple other folks, connect back with our IT side and understand what, what they think. Yeah, and then I'll probably revert back to you guys through Maggie to answer that last question of what else do we need from you guys either to decide what we want to do, or what other help do we need from you to actually produce that outcome, whatever it may be.
Okay.
But I'd say, my initial reaction, I know I've talked with my guys about this as they were going through it. My initial reaction is, we can immediately benefit from just the minimum functionality of having a tool to house, control, aggregate, report on, run variances on the multiple iterations of data that we do through scenario planning, through just our planning sessions in general. So I made reference to the October 10th version, the October whatever. Our long-term planning file is V27. So
right.
And it's not done. So
sure.
There's and it's all it's all emailed back and forth. And I should mention there's A's, B's, and C's also. So 24A, 24B, 24. So anyway, so
Yep.
Just having it to just do what we're literally doing in Excel with no more added sophistication and functionality is a benefit. And then when we get into the scenario planning, like using DSO this or percent of labor that, or the price, that stuff, as the tier ones need it, I think could benefit them. But that's just that's even secondary. And then third beyond that is what was the third thing? There was a third thing we were talking about, that like the third level where we.
Oh, the total.
No. Well, anyway, there's multiple levels that we can get into with this thing, but just in terms of no functionality whatsoever, and just using it to control data flow, I think would save a ton of time up front. So that's just my kind of core first reaction. And like I said, I'll talk with my guys, and we'll talk with our IT guys on our side, and then we'll get back with you through Maggie. But I appreciate you taking the time to stimulate these thoughts and bridge some, or make some connections between the needs we have and some of the functionality that you've been able to work through for other clients.
Hey, Guillaume, I guess one of to Eric's point, one of the next steps to answer to your question would be to review what is the exact need from the team on this topic versus what we have right now, and how we can, if we want to extend the functionality to strategic modeling, I guess this would be the first, as on our side, really looking at where this could be applied and how we should apply it if we want to.
So I'll say simply, Guillaume, that the need is, I have no mechanism to aggregate plans. and I have a planning tool that is not fast enough to keep up with the iterations that we do and the pages we have to make and the leadership reviews that we have to have. So if I live in the roll forward world and I keep living there, I will always end up defaulting to Excel templates aggregated over and over and over again until they get to V27. And that makes for not fun work. It makes for errors. It makes for disconnects. I'm sure what we just pitched to Larry yesterday, what I have in consolidation does not equal the sum of the parts. There's no, because I have no mechanism to do that, right? I caught some differences between what Gas showed and what I had, but so the minimum need is a mechanism to house and aggregate and report on the iterations that we do in planning. And if we can run the roll forward as the baseline, or even do in parallel, we can talk about more of this offline. But that's the starting desire that I have, and I don't know what the income statement guys think about it. But they're a little faster than we are. But it's strange to say it that way because I actually can't go faster than them because I have to wait for them to start my process. But anyway, it'd be interesting to get Jessica, like we've been texting or whatever, you're emailing Jessica and Galina's thoughts also.
No, I don't go back on the usage of this tool. This is great. And I agree with you. It avoids the 27 iterations on an Excel basis and the different mistakes that it can create and all this stuff. I just want to make sure to review, what is the full scope of this tool? In our FP&A process, there would be S2, there would be up plan, there would be blueprint reviews. This is kind of landscape I want to lay down to see how we can apply it and how we should deploy it to the different FP&A teams. But I'm with you. I fully understand your.
Okay. Yeah, and the way that I think about that, broadly, right, is without this portion of the tool, we're just going to be in planning. So blueprint, S2, all that stuff, we're going to be in planning, and we know that we're not nimble enough in that tool. So then then we're left with two choices. Do we want to try to do something systematic here? Or maybe there's three, right? So that, use this, use Excel, or do we want to do some other solution? Do I want to create a cash flow smart sheet that people are just typing in, it aggregates for me, but then I can't do V's on that. I can't do the scenario planning kind of functionality with that. But there could be a third way, I suppose, but that's maybe what we should bat around a little bit.
Yeah, and Barrett is on the call as well, so I guess we need to a full review with Barrett and the team and with the IT team to see what it would be the best case scenario here.
Yeah. No, I obviously the tool has a strategic place in in an organization's financial planning. My biggest concerns, Eric, just to Ezra as on the call, is how does it interact with planning? How do we accelerate some of the things you say that you're pointing out that you're not mature in right now, and then how does this play into the overall thing in the sense of when we get stretched targets from corporate, is this the tool that we use as a playground to kind of go figure out, okay, how exactly could we execute on that? And then once we've figured out what our plan is, we can divvy it up in the business and they can go do the lower level work. I just, in order to make sure that the payback on the investment is good, we just need to really make sure that internally we understand all of the different times we're actually going to be engaged in using the solution in order to make sure that the return on investment is there.
Okay. Yep.
And we probably need to start thinking about, like, Ryan, I'm thinking from your side, I don't know exactly how we would understand, from the implementation standpoint, how we could start to kind of understand what the pricing would be when you get into, like, say, implementing a standard model when we have a pretty well developed planning structure in DRM already in place, right? So how do we think about the actual investment we're going to have to make so that we can make sure that our cost benefit analysis turns positive?
Yeah, we could set up a scoping call to kind of do that, and that would really mainly be focused on, what is the level of detail that you think makes sense, having some more conversations around what type of drivers you really think you would want to have, and getting more of the use cases that are specific to how you think you would initially want to use the tool. We could have that type of scoping conversation after you guys have had a chance to noodle on it a little bit, and that'll help us formulate an estimate.
Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, we'll regroup internally and really understand. I think we've got to get the user stories laid out of all the different ways we'd want to, engage with a tool like this, and then we can then, build out the benefit case from those, and then we can talk about the investment and how they compare.
Yeah, and I think we can think medium and long term with all the different things that we can do with it, but I want to just reemphasize, we literally just turn this on and copy in an Excel file or the cash flow statement and just get people to type that in there, like type inputs into, we'll save days throughout each of the planning processes, and we can, I can put math, I can put, money behind that, but with no configuration outside of just here's what the cash flow statement looks like, just have it be an input form that then feeds the balance changes that, like that example that we did, where it's just, the balance change. Just do that for all the accounts, have it look like the cash flow statement, and then feed the actual cash flow statement output in this thing. That would like revolutionize the process here in a very simple way. So I just want to just emphasize, even starting with that, I could put pretty significant savings around, because we've got 8 different teams working, 27 different spreadsheets that are disconnected and being aggregated all over the place. The variances are being all run manually. Everything's manual.
Yep.
Okay. So it should be some quick wins anyway.
Yeah, and that's before getting into the the scenario stuff, which I think we should think about because there's value there. I just don't want to get too caught up in that, because as we get into op plan, we're just going to do it again. We're going to be throwing templates around, and it's just going to suck, and I don't want to do that again.
Eric, again, I agree with you. I mean, what you're saying is exactly where I want to go to. The only thing is we need to train people. We need to make sure, people would be using that. I don't want people to, I don't want to develop a tool if, people are still using Excel on the side. And again, this is our work. This is our homework to train people and make sure that there is a full, I would say, buy-in into this solution. But I'm with you. I'm totally with you. This is my goal as well.
And we're over on time, but Allison, are you still on? Or is anyone else on from the business? I know we invited Russ. We got tier 1 folks on here. If there's positive reactions, or would this be beneficial to you?
I'm still on. I'm still on. We're definitely struggling with the current tool and the amount it takes to use. So this looks like an efficiency. I agree. It looks like a lot faster, and that we would gain a lot from it. I think our teams are struggling with the current tool we're using. It's just especially, the response time, and just it's taking us weeks to get through the process.
Yeah. I just wanted a litmus test there. I appreciate that, Allison. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, Maggie, Kevin, let's loop us back together internally here. We'll bat all this stuff around, and then Ryan, thank you again. We'll get back to you with the feedback and upward and onward.
All right. Sounds like a plan. And I'll try and make sure I can get this recording. It's probably going to be too big to just send in the email, so we'll figure out a way to do like an FTP site or something, or a SharePoint link or whatever, and get you guys the recording.
Yeah, that'd be good for some of the income statement guys that we're on.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.